Montana Territory, July 1879. Dust curled off the plains east of Fort Benton like smoke from a fire. Dawsyn Whitlock squinted hard beneath his hat, the sun slicing across the open country as he reined in his horse at the top of a low ridge. He had not planned to stop. He was 3 days into driving cattle south, and time was chewing at his heels. But what he saw down below turned his stomach cold. A woman was being dragged behind a galloping horse. Her wrists were tied to the saddle horn with rope, her dress torn and dusty, her body bouncing hard against the ground. 2 men rode ahead, laughing like it was a game. The woman did not scream. She was too limp, too quiet. Dawsyn kicked his gelding hard and thundered down the slope. He leveled his rifle before they even noticed him. "Stop them horses," he barked. The taller man wheeled around. "This ain't your concern, friend. She's human. That makes it my concern." The shorter man reached for his holster. Dawsyn did not wait. He fired once, the bullet snapping through the dust just inches from the rider's boot. The horse reared. Rope went slack. The woman's body stilled on the ground. "Next one goes through your spine," Dawsyn warned, voice low. They left fast, one limping with a shot-up horse, the other white-faced and silent. Dawsyn dismounted the second they were out of sight, dropping beside the woman in the dirt. Her face was bloodied, lips split, one eye already swelling shut. But her chest rose, slow and steady. She was breathing. "Alive, miss," he said gently. "Can you hear me?" She flinched when he touched her shoulder. "It's all right now. I stopped them." Her eyelids fluttered open. One eye was brown, the other swollen, barely opened at all. She blinked up at him, dazed. You ain't one of them?" "No, ma'am." "My name's Dawsyn Whitlock. I saw what they were doing. You're safe now." She tried to sit up but gasped in pain. He caught her gently and eased her back down. "I'll cut the rope." "Hold still." Once freed, she curled in on herself, shaking, arms wrapped tight around her ribs like she was trying to hold herself together. He pulled a blanket from his saddle and draped it around her. "What's your name?" "Rowena," she whispered. "Rowena Zeller. How bad are you hurt?" Her voice cracked. "I do not know." He saw then the bruises on her arms, the blood on her scalp, the way her right leg bent wrong at the knee. She had been through hell. "I'm going to get you to a doctor," he said, already lifting her into his arms. Her head dropped against his chest. "Please don't leave me." "I will not." He rode with her cradled tight against him, holding her steady as the horse picked its way back toward his camp by the creek. It was a quiet ride. She did not speak again, just trembled in his arms, bones like glass beneath the blanket. By nightfall, he had her laid out on his bedroll, fire crackling nearby, water boiling for tea. He cleaned her wounds slow, careful with every touch. She winced when he cleaned her leg, but she did not cry. Not once. That kind of hurt ran deeper than the skin. When she finally slept, he stayed close by, rifle across his lap. She looked too small under the stars, like she might disappear if he looked away. The next morning, she woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of birdsong. "Morning," he said gently, crouching beside the fire. She blinked at him, confused, then remembered. Her hands shot to her chest. "They're gone," he said. "You're safe." She looked down at herself, then around at the trees. "Where are we?" "My camp. We're a day's ride from Fort Benton." "I can take you there if you want." "No." Her voice was firm. "Not there." He waited, letting her speak in her own time. "They took me from a freight camp near Judith Landing," she said quietly. "Said they would help me find work. Then they tied me up, took everything I had." He nodded slowly. "You got family?" "No, just me." He handed her the tin cup, warm and full. "You got anywhere to go?" She looked at him over the rim. "Do you?" He held her gaze. "I do now." She blinked fast, eyes glassy but dry. "Why did you help me?" "Because you needed help." And no one else was coming. She stared into the fire, her knuckles white where she clutched the blanket. "Rowena," he said after a moment, voice soft, "I will not let anything happen to you." She turned toward him slowly. "You do not know me." "I know enough." He built a lean-to for her to rest under, kept the fire burning, and cooked what little food he had. She ate in silence, but her hands steadied by the second day. She spoke more by the third. By the 5th day, she could sit up on her own, legs splinted and healing. She never asked why he stayed. He never left. One dusk, as the sun dipped low and golden, she looked at him across the fire. "You are kind, Dawsyn Whitlock." "I am trying." She hesitated. You do not have to keep me. He set down the coffee pot. I know, but you are, he nodded. I want to. Her voice dropped, barely a whisper. Why? He stood and crossed to her, crouching down so they were face to face. Because I have not known many things for sure in my life. But the second I saw you, I knew I was not letting you go. She stared up at him, lips parted, breath shallow. You mean that? I do. Her hand reached for his, hesitant, then firm. Then stay, she said. Please. So he stayed. And under the stars that night, her head on his shoulder, her breath warm against his neck, Dawsyn Whitlock knew something had changed. He had saved her. But somehow she'd saved him right back. Rowena sat with her back against a cottonwood trunk, a book resting open on her lap though her eyes hadn't touched the page in near an hour. A hawk wheeled high above the creek, its call sharp and distant. The day had warmed, the kind of heat that settled low and slow into the bones. Her leg, wrapped tight and stiff, ached with the changing weather, but she bore it without complaint. Dawsyn was kneeling a little way off, tightening the cinch on the pack mule. He moved with quiet precision, long fingers tugging leather into place. His hat shaded his face, but she'd learned to read him anyway in the angle of his shoulders, the pauses between motions, the way he sometimes stood still and listened like the earth might whisper something he needed to hear. You always this quiet? She asked, her voice soft. He didn't glance up. Only when I got company worth listening to. She touched the edge of her book, fingers tracing the worn fabric of its spine. You don't look like a man who reads much. I read sign, trails, faces, books, not so much. What do you see in my face then? He stood, brushing dust from his knees. Storms and iron, her eyes narrowed. That's supposed to be flattery? No, just truth. She closed the book and set it aside. You ever been married? No, why not? He hesitated, then walked over and crouched near her, keeping a respectful distance. Never stayed in one place long enough. Never met someone who made me wish I had. She tilted her head. And now, he looked at her then, full and plain. Now I think I could stay. Her throat tightened, but she didn't look away. You don't even know what I've done. I know what was done to you. That's enough. She folded her hands in her lap, thumb brushing a thin scar on her wrist. I was born in Missouri. My father died when I was 12. My mother remarried a man who drank more than he worked. By 16, I was gone, worked in kitchens, stitched hems, swept floors. Then the freighter camp, she stopped. That part you already saw. He didn't speak, just waited. I never had anything of my own, nothing that stayed. Sometimes I think I don't know how to hold on to good things. You're still here. That's only because you stopped them. He shook his head. No, you held on. I just gave you a moment long enough to do it. The wind stirred the grass. She watched it bend and sway, then reached for her crutch. He stood quickly, offering his arm without a word. She accepted it, rising slow, her weight shifting carefully. I want to try walking farther today, she said. To the ridge, all right. They moved together through the waist-high grass, his steps steady, hers measured but determined. At the ridge, she paused, breath shallow from the climb. The open land stretched wide before them, rolling hills, distant buttes, a sky so big it made her feel both tiny and held. I used to dream of a patch of ground, she said. With a cabin, chickens maybe, something with roots. You still want that? I don't know. She turned to him. Could you? I've got the hands for fence posts, and I don't mind chickens. She laughed, surprised by how easily it came. You'd build it with me, if you'd let me. They stood in silence, the sun low behind them, shadows stretching long. I don't want to be kept, she said finally. I want to be chosen. He met her gaze, voice low and certain. Then let me choose you. Her hand found his, warm and sure. You're not what I expected, she whispered. Neither are you. And there, on the ridge above the creek where he first carried her out of the dust, Rowena Zeller leaned into Dawsyn Whitlock's side, steady on her feet, heart open just enough to start again. Rowena folded the last of the shirts into Dawson's saddlebag, her fingers brushing the faded cotton as if memorizing each seam. The pack mule waited nearby, its ears twitching at flies. In the days since she'd walked to the ridge, her leg had steadied enough to let her move through camp without the crutch, though each step still carried a quiet grit. She hadn't said anything, but Dawsyn noticed. He always noticed. I thought you said we weren't going to Fort Benton. she said as he approached, his rifle slung over one shoulder, a coil of rope in his hand. "We aren't," he replied. "There's a town south of the Marias, smaller, stores run by a woman, and the sheriff ain't a drunk. Figured we'd get provisions there, let your leg rest a few nights under a roof." She nodded slowly. "You've been there before, passed through last spring, dusty place, but quiet." Rowena tightened the leather strap on the bag. "You trust quiet towns? I trust you more than I trust places." He said it like it was nothing, but it landed heavy in her chest, like a stone dropped into still water. She didn't answer, just handed him the bag. They rode out before noon, the sun high but softened some by a slow haze. The trail wound through low hills thick with pine and sage, the scent rising warm around them. She rode her own horse this time, a chestnut gelding Dawsyn had traded for with an old trapper who owed him a favor. The saddle was too wide, but she kept steady, her hands sure despite the ache in her leg. "Mama used to say dust tells the truth," she said after a while, her voice quiet beneath the rhythm of hooves. Dawsyn glanced over. "How's that? You can lie with words, but not with tracks. Dust shows where you've been, who you followed, who followed you." He considered that, then nodded. "Your mama sounds like a woman who paid close attention." She didn't have the luxury of looking away. They rode on, the silence between them easy. "You miss her?" he asked. "I miss what she could have been if life had been kinder." He didn't press. He never did. They reached the edge of town by evening. It wasn't more than a cluster of buildings, a mercantile, a blacksmith shed, a church with a tilted steeple, and a few homes with smoke curling from chimneys. A woman in a gray dress stood sweeping her porch as they passed. She nodded once, her gaze lingering on Rowena's bandaged leg, then on Dawson's broad frame behind her. No judgment in her eyes, just watchfulness. They left the horses at a livery stable, the old caretaker muttering about feed costs and a sick colt. Dawsyn paid without haggling, and together they walked down the main street, boots scuffing in the dust. "You hungry?" he asked. "I could eat." The boarding house sat above the mercantile. Inside, a man with a limp and a thick beard served them stew with hard bread and coffee that tasted of burnt chicory. They ate in a corner, the clatter of forks and chairs around them like distant thunder. Rowena's eyes stayed on her bowl. "You ever think about what you'd be if you hadn't ended up a trail hand?" He leaned back, gaze on the window where the last light faded into night. "Maybe a smith, my pa was one, had hands like iron and a voice like a bell. You close with him?" "No, but I remember the sound of his hammer." "That stayed with me," she nodded, then set her spoon down. "You think people can make a new name for themselves, not just run from the old one, but build something different." He reached across the table and laid his hand over hers, firm and steady. "You're already doing it." They stayed in the same room that night, 2 cots, a shared basin, a cracked window letting in the rustle of leaves. She didn't ask him to stay close, but he pulled his cot near hers anyway, where he could hear her breathe. She didn't sleep much. Neither did he. In the morning, he found her sitting beside the window, hair braided back, hands resting in her lap. "I've been thinking," she said. He waited. "You saved me, Dawsyn, but I don't want to live like a thing that was rescued. I want to be your equal. You always were." She looked up, eyes clear. "Then marry me." He blinked, chest drawing tight. "You sure?" "I've never been more." He crossed the room in 2 long strides and took her hands in his. "Then let's do it proper." They spoke to the preacher that afternoon, under the cottonwood tree behind the church. No guests, no gowns, no rings. Just the 2 of them, hands clasped, the preacher's voice steady in the wind. When it was done, Dawsyn looked at her like a man who'd finally found a place to belong. Rowena looked back like a woman who'd finally stopped running. They left town the next morning with supplies packed, 2 horses side by side, and a patch of land 3 days' ride west already marked in his memory, a place with a creek, black soil, and enough quiet for 2 people to begin again. Neither of them looked back. The land was nestled between 2 arms of pine-covered hills, where the soil darkened near a bend in the creek, and the wind moved slow through the grass. Dawsyn had remembered it true. By the time they reached it, the sun had dropped behind the western slope, casting the clearing in a soft amber that touched every stone and root like it belonged to some older, gentler world. Rowena dismounted stiffly, her legs sore from the ride but holding. She stepped into the clearing and stood still, letting the place speak to her. The trees swayed but didn't crowd. The ground underfoot was dry, not cracked. A stand of quaking aspen marked the north edge, their leaves whispering above the hush of the water. "This it?" she asked, not turning. Dawsyn stepped beside her. "It is," she nodded once. "Then it's ours." They set up camp near the creek, not far from a cluster of flat stones that would later become a hearth. That first evening they didn't speak much, both working in quiet rhythm, tying the horses, unrolling the bedding, starting a fire with dry pine shavings and flint. When the flames caught, she sat beside it, warming her fingers. "You ever built a place from nothing before?" she asked. "No. But I've fixed enough broken ones to figure it out." She studied his hands in the firelight, broad, sure, calloused at the edges, then looked out toward the trees. "I want a table by the window," she said. "With 2 chairs." He glanced over. "That all, for now." He tossed another branch onto the fire, sparks lifting into the dusk. "I'll start digging the post holes tomorrow." She reached for his hand, threading her fingers through his without looking. "I want to help, you will. But tomorrow you rest." "I'm not made for resting." He squeezed her hand gently. "You are now." They slept beneath the open sky, the stars sharp as pins overhead. His arm was warm across her waist, and when she woke once in the night, she found his breath steady against her neck. She didn't fall back asleep for a long time, but she didn't mind the waiting. The next morning he rose early, shoulders damp with dew as he moved through the tall grass to mark the plot. She watched from her bedroll, eyes half-lidded, listening to the scrape of his boot dragging lines in the dirt. He wasn't a man who spoke to himself or filled the quiet with muttering. He measured by instinct, then drove the first stake into the ground. She joined him by mid-morning, carrying a tin cup of boiled coffee. He took it without a word, tipping it back with a nod of thanks. "You always this sure about things?" she asked. "Only when they matter." She shaded her eyes. "You think we'll get it done before the snow? We'll have the walls and roof up before the leaves drop. After that, the stove'll keep us." She ran her fingers over one of the stakes. "I've never had a place that was mine, not really." "You will now." She looked at him long then, gaze steady. "I want to keep bees, not yet, but next spring." He didn't laugh or question it, just said, "I'll build the boxes." They worked side by side for the next 3 weeks. She couldn't lift much, not yet, but she measured, steadied boards, held the level while he hammered. She learned to spot which trees would split clean and which ones would twist the grain. He showed her how to lash the joists tight with hemp cord until they could trade for nails. Each evening, they sat on the low ridge above the build site and watched the shape of their home rise in the hollow, first the posts, then the beams, then the rafters laid out like a rib cage against the sky. One afternoon, as she tied bundles of thatch for the roofline, she paused and looked across the clearing. "You think we'll have children?" Dawsyn didn't answer right away. He was fitting a beam into the north wall, his shoulders streaked with sweat and sawdust. "If we do," he said finally, "they'll know what it means to belong." She turned back to her work, but her hands were steadier. By the second month, the walls stood firm and the roof kept out the rain. The door hadn't been hung yet, and the windows were just open frames, but the wind moved through them like it had always known the place. That night, they slept inside for the first time, curled together on a bed of pine boughs and wool. "This is good," she whispered, tracing the line of his jaw with her thumb. He kissed her palm. "It's just the beginning." That winter would come hard, and the road back to town would vanish beneath snow more than once. But that night, in the half-built cabin with her breath against his throat and their future laid bare in the beams above, Dawsyn Whitlock knew there was nothing left to run from. And Rowena, whose life had been defined by what she'd escaped, finally had something to build. The first snow came early that year, sifting down in soft, silent flurries that caught on the eaves and the corners of the window frames Dawsyn had trimmed by hand. Inside the cabin, warmth pooled from the iron stove, and Rowena stood at the table with a pot of boiled apples cooling near her elbow. She stirred slowly, careful not to break the softened skins, her focus quiet and settled. Dawsyn leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, watching her with the kind of patience that didn't need filling. He'd spent the morning splitting seasoned pine, stacking it tight along the north wall to keep the wind out. His gloves still hung by the hearth, drying from the damp. "I never learned to bake proper," Rowena said, not looking up. "But I remember the way it smelled when someone else did." "You didn't need to," he replied. "You've already done the hard part." She glanced at him, brow raised. "You made it yours." Rowena turned back to the pot, lips pressing together in thought. "I've been thinking we could clear the slope west of the creek come spring. There's enough good soil for squash, maybe corn if the frost holds off." He stepped closer, taking the wooden spoon from her and setting it aside. "We will." Her hands rested on the edge of the table, fingers tapping once. "I was afraid I'd feel trapped, staying in one place. And now, I feel steady." He brushed a strand of hair behind her ear. "You've been steady since the day I found you." She leaned into the touch, then reached into her apron pocket and drew out a folded scrap of paper. "This came from the storekeeper in town. I traded for it when we picked up the kettle hooks." She handed it to him. He unfolded it, eyes scanning the neat script. "Land deed claim. I sent it off last week with the last of our coin. The boundaries drawn around the creek bend and the western rise. It'll be ours after the thaw." He looked at her for a long moment, then set the deed on the table and pulled her close, arms wrapping around her waist. "You did this," she nodded against his chest. "I wanted to surprise you. You did." They stood like that, bodies warm and still in the quiet room. Outside, snow kissed the glass panes and the pine boughs bowed with the weight of it. Later, they sat together on the low bench beside the hearth, her legs draped across his lap, his thumb tracing the ridge of her knuckles. The fire snapped and settled, casting long shadows on the cabin walls. Rowena tilted her head, studying the flicker of light across his face. "Do you ever miss the trail?" Dawsyn rested his chin on her temple. "Not the miles, just the stars," she smiled, a slow curve of understanding. "We can sleep outside come summer. I'll bring the quilt." He kissed her hair. "A whole sky just for us." She didn't answer, just tucked her face into his neck, the cabin around them holding firm and close, like a promise made good. By midwinter, the pantry was lined with jars of preserves and sacks of dried beans. Dawsyn had strung a wooden cradle together from leftover boards, not because there was a need yet, but because Rowena had mentioned it once, soft and half asleep, and he'd remembered. One evening, as the wind pushed heavy against the walls, she placed her hand over his on the table and said, "I think it's time." He looked at her, heart thudding once behind his ribs. "You're sure?" She nodded, eyes wide but steady. "I want a family." "With you?" He didn't speak, just leaned forward and kissed her, slow and certain, the fire casting gold across their skin. And that night they loved one another without fear. All the ghosts of their pasts finally laid quiet beneath the snow. Spring came late, the thaw slow to pull back from the hills, but when it did, the land woke in green. Rowena knelt in the garden bed, tucking beans into the soil with careful fingers, her belly just beginning to round beneath her apron. Dawsyn carved fence posts by the edge of the clearing, eyes flicking now and then to where she worked. She caught him watching once and laughed, a sound full and bright. "What?" she called. "Just making sure you're real." She dusted her hands on her skirt. "I am. And I'm staying." The bees came in early May. They'd traded for a hive box from a traveling tinker, and Rowena tended it with quiet diligence, her veil stitched from muslin and lace. Dawsyn built her a bench near the hive where she could sit when her back ached, and she carved her initials into the armrest beside his. By the time the child came, the cabin had a second room, a hand pump well, and shutters painted soft blue. Their daughter was born in the early dark of an August morning, her cry sharp and strong against the hush of dawn. Dawsyn held her first, hands trembling as he wrapped her in a wool blanket Rowena had sewn from their wedding quilt scraps. "She's perfect," he said, voice rough. Rowena, pale and breathless, smiled from the bed. "She's ours." They named her Clara after no one in particular, just a name that felt like light. Years passed. The orchard they planted bloomed. The garden grew. The fence held. And the cabin stood through every season steadfast and kind, like the love that built it. And in the quiet of the long evenings, after Clara had gone to sleep and the fire had dimmed to coals, Dawsyn would pull Rowena close, her head resting against his shoulder. "I never thought I'd have this," he'd whisper. She'd smile against his chest, her voice warm and sure. "You didn't find it, Dawsyn. You built it." And he would hold her until sleep came, the stars high above their roof, the wind soft through the trees, and everything they had made between them held close and true, forever.